You touched on a lot of different topics, and one that's always stuck with me, and it's always kind of been vexing to me, and it's got to be cultural. You talked about the issue of Me Too drugs. What you've said, I've heard, and others have probably heard year after year, is you've got to end the Me Too or Me Better drugs and do better, but there still seems to be an appetite to produce them.
Yeah.
This is cultural
Yes.
in pharma, and I don't know, and can you give evidence that there's actually people now seriously turning away and going countercultural in this respect?
So I'd like to think that GSK gets it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the focus on incremental improvements on Me Too products, on I'll take that target and I'll develop a better compound for it, comes from a belief that that is a low-risk approach. And indeed, historically, I think there has been a low-risk approach. And the reason it's been a low-risk approach is because the market has rewarded that. You know, if you look at the history of a class of medicines, it's actually rarely the first one that's been the most successful. It's the second or the third, or in the case of statins, the fifth, I think.
Yeah.
So the market has rewarded that historically, particularly, actually, the US market. But that is changing, and with that change is a profound change to the nature of risk in the R&D pipeline. So it used to be that analysts would look at your pipeline and they'd look at all the stuff that was novel mechanism and they'd go, oh, that's very risky. And they'd look at all the stuff that was sort of Me Too and they go, well, I know that's going to work. I know the market it goes into. I can predict that. And you got rewarded essentially for having a stable, safe pipeline. And a stable, safe pipeline meant a load of Me Too products. The problem is there's an adage in R&D which is you want to fail early and fail cheaply. And indeed, that's a very useful thing to do. It's obviously the objective. However, the objective actually is to succeed. But if you're going to fail, you want to fail early and fail cheaply. So the issue is the example of failing. The opposite of that is basically failing late and failing expensively. And the worst example of that is to put all the money in, get it all the way to the market, and then have it fall over commercially because it lacks differentiation. And what we're seeing now is products that lack differentiation are being punished in the marketplace. And it's true in the US, but it's also true around the world. Everybody, as I said, has different approaches to it, but they are not rewarding incremental or non-innovation. And what that means is it completely reverses the riskiness of the pipeline. If you're sitting there with a bunch of stuff that's essentially Me Too in phase 3, you have the riskiest pipeline in the world, because the chances of that differentiating from what is out there on the market is next to zero. However, if you actually have entirely new mechanisms, entirely new modalities of therapy, and you're going after diseases that are incredibly risky, yes, you are likely to have early on quite a high failure rate. But if you do get a product that works, if you are successful, you are likely then to have something that really adds value to patients and to payers and to providers. And so I think the whole dynamic of what constitutes risk in the R&D setting has changed over the last decade, and companies like GSK are putting an emphasis on innovation. The other thing I think that companies are doing, just very... Yeah?
No, sure. No. We got 16 minutes and 50 seconds.
Cool. 10 seconds on this. The other thing companies that have done in the past is, I will invest my R&D where I am commercially successful. It's a big mistake. There is nothing to say that simply because you're commercially successful in an area, that area is ripe for innovation. So the other thing that people have done is they've moved and they're invest their R&D where the science tells you that you are likely to be able to create truly innovative products, where there's new groundbreaking scientific discoveries, which may or may not be related to where you happen to be commercially successful. But simply pounding away at tried and tested techniques where you happen to have had a success is been a recipe for failure for our industry, a recipe for lack of productivity.
So, and you're maybe intimating this, so if somebody's been great at Alzheimer's drugs and they have 3 of them on the market, they shouldn't keep going, I know. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They should chase diabetes. They should go another way.
They should go. So
even though that's not in their wheelhouse.
Even though it may not be in their wheelhouse, if you pound away at, so GSK is a really good example. GSK has a fantastic respiratory franchise, and we've invested an awful lot in our respiratory franchise historically. And we've got some good drugs that are coming through to the market out of it. But arguably, there's nothing. We had to change our approach to that, and we had to change the mechanisms we were going after, and we had to look for where the really novel science is in order to get there. And companies aren't necessarily that good at it. So if there happens to be a convergence between where you're commercially successful and great new science, all well and good. But don't drive your R&D on the basis of where you are commercially successful currently, because the lag time's too long, and there's no evidence to suggest that just plugging away at something is going to yield results.
What, you don't have to name names, because we have many colleagues in the audience. What percentage of the industry follows that approach?
I actually think now, so I think we're in a bit of a transitional zone. So if you look at the late stage pipelines of most pharmaceutical companies, you'll find a blend, you'll find a mix, because we've got a 10 to 15 year life cycle. So if I want to implement a strategy now, you're going to see the effect of it in R&D in 10 or 15 years time. But so the late stages of most companies, I think, reflect that. There's some very novel stuff, and then there's some stuff that was conceived under an earlier age and is maybe a bit more like the Me Too's. But if you go back into the discovery end, then I think you find a lot more innovation. I would actually say most pharmaceutical companies now get it. Now, that's not going to arrive on the market for another 7+ years maybe, but most pharmaceutical companies get it. And the other sort of adage is, if you're not starting off highly innovative, the one thing that happens during R&D, those of you who engage in it know, is you get disappointed. You get incrementally disappointed. You think you've got something fantastic, and when you end up, you've rarely got what that promising, in early in vivo or in vitro results gave you. You've got something that's more nuanced, more subtle, not quite as effective. And so if you're not starting off with something great, chances are you'll end up with something fairly mediocre. So you need to start off with the most innovative, the obviously, if this works, it will sell itself type approach.
So we have a few questions, and I'm going to call them beyond the pill questions. And they largely are fascinating in what your thoughts are about how you see the pharmaceutical industry converging with the health IT industry, and how can leveraging mobile or other digital technologies to really benefit adherence and maybe many of the other issues that pharma has to have. How is that merging of two sides successfully going to happen going forward?
It's tough. I think so there's a huge sort of spectrum of stuff that you can cover that. I think if we take the pure information and analysis piece, so we look at sort of like all the data that's out there at the moment that is not owned by pharmaceutical companies about how pharmaceuticals perform. I think there's a huge industry around understanding, assimilating, and making that meaningful for people. And it sits in very many different places, and it has a varying degrees of quality. So I think that's one piece, and that's something that I think pharma is very interested in engaging on. And there's a number of regulatory hurdles and issues associated with it. But in terms of us understanding our products better, I think there's an obvious traction there with payers, with providers, and with other people who are IT services, for example. I think within the adherence, I think that's I still think it's in a fairly emerging state at the moment, and the reason I think it's in an emerging state I'm not sure it has that much to do with pharma's desire or the availability of solutions. I actually think it has to do with the integration of those solutions into the healthcare ecosystem. So just the idea of tracking symptoms. So my wife has multiple sclerosis, and she turned up to a neurologist a couple of months ago, and she had been using one of those things to track her symptoms, which are many and come and go, and her neurologist was flabbergasted. Now, this is the head of the multiple sclerosis unit at the University of Pennsylvania, so major teaching hospital and very well known physician with a huge practice. Kathy was the first person to walk in and say, this is what's happening with my symptoms. And I think you're really just starting to see that. And actually, I think the issue there, or the thing that's going to really help there, is actually a force that is currently not really emerging yet, but will be a real driving force for the industry over the next 5 to 10 years, is the increasing consumerization of this. So increasing consumerization of healthcare. And the trigger for that is fairly obviously the increasing percentage of the cost of healthcare that is going to be pushed down onto individual patients. And when somebody is actually paying for something, they're going to take a hell of a lot more interest in what they're paying for and what value they're getting out for it. Hopefully, the upside is very much more engaged in their treatment, engaged in their healthcare, and starting to adopt approaches to monitor themselves. And I actually think it's that consumerization, individual adoption of tools that will really drive that relationship between IT and pharma and other aspects of healthcare and the use in compliance or adherence.
So, for you, the customer has been a payer and the government.
Yep.
So as your customer, so you're saying, for you, the customer has changed, or will change.
Yes.
And so when you think about the patient as a customer, again, how soon does that happen? You talked about consumerization. It's obviously the trigger for you to really look more at apps and tech. What needs to happen for that trigger to occur and make them a real customer?
So I think, if you chart the progress of the customer for the pharma industry, once upon a time the customer was pretty clear. The customer was the physician. Yeah. That was the source of prescribing power. And what we've seen, obviously, in the last 5 years is a shift from the physician to the payer. And what's happening now, and you can see it if you look at the Affordable Care Act, you look at the implementation of state-based healthcare exchanges, and you look at the types of plans that are going to be offered in those exchanges, you can see that consumers are going to be turning up to those exchanges and making choices about healthcare in a way that actually has not been quite as obvious as before, because the full spectrum of potential healthcare options, insurance options, is likely to be available to them. And they really have to make choices. And part of those choices will be, what pharmacy do I want? What level of pharmacy coverage do I want? And the reason for that is that the payer, and partially due to the constraints that are being placed upon it, partially just due to the overall burgeoning cost of healthcare, is pushing an increasing amount down onto the consumer. That's the trigger, to me, for the consumer caring. That's the trigger for the consumer saying, well, if I'm paying 20% of my hospital bills because I purchased a not particularly gold-plated platinum plan, then I am going to care an awful lot. It's going to hurt me financially if I have to go to the hospital because I was non-compliant with my COPD medication. Mm-hmm. So an exacerbation at that point is not simply then a dangerous thing for them. It's also financially hugely non-beneficial. And then they can make trade-offs. They can say, okay, so I'm going to have to buy a bit more of the medicine and trade that off against the hospital, the exacerbation. And I think the economic triggers, okay, you could argue that some things are pretty obvious people should be doing anyway, but actually they're not. Patients on some of our drugs are not nearly as compliant as you would anticipate if you were taking a rational view of their rate of hospitalization versus the drugs that they're taking. And yet, so that engagement, driven by the economics, I think will produce a consumerization effect in the healthcare market. And if you want a timescale, I think it's there's a generational aspect to it as well. So as this generation becomes mature, this generation of teenagers and early adults becomes mature and starts caring, stops believing that they're invincible, and starts caring about their own healthcare, they're going to start to seek the information and the tools in a way that I think previous generations, mine included, didn't.
Digital natives, just the early adopters finally getting of age where they need to take drugs.
They do.
Yeah. it's interesting. We have a lot of questions around compensation for sales reps, and I'm going to scroll down to a few of these.
Yeah.
There's an issue of, and I'm going to read this verbatim, and I'll read a couple. Will hospital systems and ACOs direct their employed physicians to prescribe on a formulary, and what are the implications, for detail reps?
Yep.
And another question and I apologize. How do you move the industry and policies forward when pharmacos are not operating in a more unified manner? Example, sales comp.
Yep.
Those are issues around development, and you can take those two questions, or you can speak to the bigger issue of where you see some of these changes. Because I know even small. You mentioned the triangle. I mean, you have very innovative approaches now to how you handle sales. I don't think the sales reps would necessarily agree that it's innovative, but what do you think of those questions and overall?
So I'll touch on the second question there around how the unification of the pharmaceutical industry's approach to this. Just to say that there's an African saying that if you want to go fast, you go alone, and if you want to go far, you go with people. You go together. And I think we took the view that we wanted to go fast on this. Now, ultimately, the industry is going to have to go far, and we're going to need to do it together. But I think in taking this first step, we wanted to go fast. We wanted to get this done for GSK, and in a way, yes, we're taking a bit of a out there leadership position. What was the first question around?
I'll go back and get it.
How's it working in where people are told to write to formulary? So
that's right.
Well, I think that actually speaks to a slightly different point that I was making before, which is that the heterogeneity of the customer now. So the customer has stopped being simply the physician and is partially payer, but also the hospital networks, the corporate-owned networks, the integrated delivery networks, all of whom represent a particular type of customer for us. And this is moving, therefore, from being a consumer-type sell, essentially, even though it's to a physician, to a business-to-business sell. And it requires a discussion about, okay, what are the issues that you, as an integrated delivery network, are facing in your objective to provide quality care at a price point that's reasonable, and how can our products and how can we help in achieving your objectives? And actually, if your products are adding value to that, that is actually quite a reasonable discussion to have. It's quite a good discussion, and actually we've found that particularly when people realize that the people who are calling them are not actually incentivized by just driving up the number of scripts on a short-term basis, but actually realize this is a long-term discussion about the value of our medicines to our customers, be they patients or integrated delivery networks. Once they realize that, that's actually a discussion that we've found is very productive. And we've had a number of areas where we were not allowed to have discussions with key decision makers or physicians within a network, where actually following the changes to our compensation, people are saying, well, now actually the discussion's different. And I want to sort of change this very slightly, acknowledging I've only got 1 minute 41 seconds left. I want to change. The patient-first discussion is not simply an incentive compensation discussion. It goes way deeper than that. It goes to what is the primary purpose of a pharmaceutical rep, and what are the tools that pharmaceutical representative needs to have in order to be effective at that job. And that job ultimately is educating people about the value of our medicines. And so they need to have an exquisite, detailed, in-depth understanding of our medicines. They need to have a fantastic understanding of the healthcare system into which they are proposing that medicine be prescribed, and what the issues are, and how that medicine help, and how ultimately it adds value. And so it goes way beyond just the question of compensation. And the competencies that I spoke about, that we measure our sales reps on, are all linked to how well they understand and can be effective in communicating the medicines and the business issues that those medicines help solve.
All right, we have one more question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks. So I take your point on the focus on other disease states other than just the blockbuster products. But what is increasingly happening is drugs are being developed in smaller markets, and the price is therefore going up so that organizations can recoup the cost.
Yep.
And I'm curious how you folks think about copay programs, which really prevent one of the payers, i.e. the patient, from really understanding what the actual cost is. How do you sync up those kinds of efforts with an effort to try to demonstrate value to the patient?
Yeah. So I think start with our medicines need to demonstrate value to all of the groups, all of our customer groups, so payer, provider, patient. So yeah, it's not simply value to one of them will win. If you're not demonstrating across the board, you're not going to be successful. I take a bit of issue with the question around the relationship between population size and price. So clearly, within the population, within like very rare diseases, those can be very expensive to develop when one has regard to the end state. But actually, a lot of the things that people are looking at to drive that specificity and thereby that value of a medicine to a patient are the net result of that is to change and in many cases to decrease the cost of developing that medicine. So, example, a hypothetical example, as opposed to a real one. But one of the reasons that depression drugs cost so much to develop at the moment, or have done in the past, is because the separation from placebo of even some of the best antidepressants on the market needs to be tested in thousands of patients to observe. Okay? The reason for that is actually for every class of depressant or every individual antidepressant, the population who respond is a subset of the overall population. Okay? The easiest way to increase the treatment effect would be to be able to pre-select the people that will work on. If you do that, you could take the size of the trial down by 80%. So if I could tell you within 80% confidence which 25% of the patients this antidepressant will work on, I could save an enormous amount of money in the development. So the fact that I then have a product that only works for 25% of that population is actually not a problem, because I've spent a hell of a lot less developing it, point one. Secondly, I can give a much better assurance to the patient and to the payer that this drug will be effective. So all in all, actually the value to the system is higher. So I'm not entirely convinced about the economics that says simply because I'm focusing on a smaller population, I need to charge more, because my purpose of focusing on a smaller population is to identify those patients that it really works in, usually.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Everyone, thank you.
Thank you.